to Drive to Survive, new series, February the 23rd. On a scale of 1 to 10, how excited are you about the Netflix series, latest series coming out?
Well, I don't subscribe to Netflix, so I can't really. I mean, you're not offering me 0 to 10, so it was something below 1, I have to say. And it's kind of this sort of gossamer, fairyland of stuff that, to me, doesn't sit with Fangio going through the downhill S's at Rouen in a 250F Maserati in a four-wheel drift. And that is the disconnect that I'm talking about. And I think that disconnect could have been avoided. In fairness to Martin, he wasn't around at Monza in 78 when Vittorio Brambilla was hit by a front wheel and was unconscious for I don't know how many days. And he wasn't around, obviously, at Watkins Glen when Francois Sever was killed or Marcus Hottinger was killed by guardrail straight into the cockpit area. And so it goes on, Peter Revson. And so you only have to have lived through those moments to just know innately that we've got to be as safe as we can. We can't have those days ever again.
Over the course of a championship, if you had to pick one between Prost and Senna, I've always wanted to ask you this: which one are you going for?
If they're racing against one another in the same team, you mean?
Yeah. Over the course of a championship.
Well, I would always have gone with.
Hello and welcome to another F1 Hour with my friend, your friend, the greatest F1 mind in the business, Mr. Peter D. Windsor. How are you doing, sir?
Well, I'm all right. I'm a bit stunned by your introduction there, Cameron. Don't go over the top now, mate. You're a good guy, but I mean, don't exaggerate.
Peter, the only truth say on the F1 Hour. Peter, can I ask you a question about this Madrid Grand Prix announcement?
Yeah.
How did you react to it in the first instance? And is this is this in keeping with F1 selling its soul to the highest bidder?
Well, my reaction was, no real surprise, because when we were doing the exhibition in Madrid last summer, April actually, we heard all the whispers then. It was one of the reasons that we were there, of course. And we had a lot of the dignitaries from Madrid at the exhibition, and we were I was looking at all the roads and sort of walking around thinking, oh, well, this is going to be the pit area. This is going to be the start finish line or whatever. So, yeah, and I just had the confirmation of that 6 months later with no real surprise, A. And B, I think a lot of people are saying there's a trend now towards relatively boring new street circuits that, first of all, they choose the city, and then they choose the amount of money it's going to make and how profitable it's going to be. And then they think about, maybe we've got to try and put a racetrack in there somewhere, and they fit it in between all the buildings, and it turns out to be a relatively boring circuit. And we've had a lot of that. So in that sense, you could argue from a purist point of view, yeah, definitely the soul is disappearing, in that nobody at the planning stage is saying, yeah, but where are we going to put Eau Rouge here? And where are we going to put the Suzuka S's? And where are we going to put Beckett's or Cops? And there's none of that. And I think, you get drivers like Max who are not afraid to speak out, who say, this is not a trend that he's particularly fond of. And I agree with that. I really, me, I mean, I'm always thinking outside the box, I think, and it's probably why none of my ideas ever come to fruition. But I really don't understand why, for example, at Vegas, they didn't just take advantage of the desert and build a Nürburgring, state-of-the-art Formula One circuit forevermore that would have been the greatest venue of all time. And that could have been very near the city. So they could have had all the benefits of being by Vegas, but had this amazing thing. Same goes to the Saudi Arabian thing. They could have built Spa there, replica of Spa. Why not? And yet there's this thing now about going to cities. I mean, breaks all the rules that Bernie set up, which are street races are fine so long as somebody else is paying all the bills and there's no disruption and there's no negativity from the locals. And of course, that's the problem with street circuits, all those things. You've got to rebuild the circuit every year, and not all of it, but certainly half of it in the case of most of them. And then there's always the negativity, and there's always the relatively boring nature of the tracks. Another problem, of course, is that Formula One now, I think, is pretty self-satisfied with 2 to 3 DRS zones and the increase in technology for photography, whether it be onboards, whether it be slow-mos, super slow-mos, the sound, they can make anything look pretty dramatic, regardless of how boring the circuit is. And that's an issue, isn't it? And for everybody, for every purist that says, well, you know, Riyadh's a pretty boring circuit, you're going to get a lot of newcomers to Formula One saying, oh, wow, what a race, unbelievable DRS, you know, crashes, this, that. And so I fear we're going in the direction of the latter. And yeah, you know, I'm going to miss Barcelona. It's a long answer, but I'm going to miss Barcelona because I love turn two. I love the exit of 2 into 3. I liked 4 as a corner. I think 9 was one of the great corners of Grand Prix racing, and the last corner, minus the chicane, was a great corner as well. And we're not going to have those, and that's a great shame.
And it only seems like this thing is going to get worse, right? That I'm hearing that there is chat about Suzuka potentially being removed from the calendar soon, which I know a lot of fans, including yourself, will not be too pleased about. I mean, from an FIA FOM perspective, Peter, are they just not taking? What's the alternative? How could they keep a Suzuka and a Spa on the calendar and still monetize them well and keep bringing new eyes on the Formula One calendar? Or are those two things not?
Well, as I said, to me, the solution, if Safe Suzuka is not viable commercially from Formula One's business plan perspective, and that's a whole nother argument, because that takes me into my other thing of, are commercial rights and the sale of commercial rights a good thing for Formula One and for sport in general? That's a whole nother subject. But putting that to one side, it again brings me back to the lack of imagination, because if Suzuka is unable to match other countries that are now coming into the calendar with massive amounts of money, then the solution surely is to do exactly what I just said. And you build a Suzuka in a country which can afford to pay for a replica of Suzuka. I don't know why they don't do that. You know, if a Middle Eastern country, a new country, wants to come in with a massive amount of money, okay, this is one of the prerequisites. We want a replica of the Nürburgring, we want a replica of Spa, we want a replica of Suzuka, and build it here, and we want all the infrastructure around it. Go for it. And in the long run, it'll be much cheaper than doing a street circuit in the middle of your city, and you'll be able to use it 24/7, 365.
It's a good shout.
But nobody seems to be saying that and doing that, and I'm astonished that I seem to be the only person in the entire world of Formula One that's even suggesting that, let alone banging on about it. And that would solve all the problems, really, because, okay, we wouldn't be going to Japan, and we wouldn't have the beauty of racing in Japan and the wonderful fans there that sit endlessly in the rain waiting for the action, and nothing else is happening until the Formula One cars go out. We'd lose all of that and the wonderful artistry and creativity of the Japanese fans. But at least we could keep Suzuka in essence. And if you think about Turkey, one of the reasons Turkey was a good circuit was because of that corner. And why was that corner created? It was created because Hermann Tilke was trying to bring in some of the essence of some of the other great racetracks, and then that corner got replicated kind of in America, in Austin. Not as good, because there's nothing like the same entry speed, but it's a trend that we're almost touching, but we're not grasping and getting hold of it. And I think in the long run, hopefully, people will start to realize that we can't have a Formula One that doesn't have great corners.
Peter, I don't disagree with you. I feel like it's they're just prioritizing access, though, right? That's why they can't build that. Like you said earlier, they're just picking the location and almost squeezing a square shape into a round hole. It just feels like monetization and access, which of course monetization is a function of, over absolutely everything, whether that's good racing or very sexy curves. They don't care. And sadly for them, I think that's going to drive a lot of the old school die-hard F1 fans away from the sport. So there's an equal and opposite as far as new eyes versus people who don't want to watch it anymore because Suzuka and Silverstone, God forbid, might not be on the calendar for too long.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I think because of DRS, because of sprint races, because of potentially reverse grid races, they think, oh well, it doesn't really matter what circuit we build, so long as it's got straights and high-speed braking areas and lots of room for DRS, we can do it, and we'll make up for it with cameras and great camera work, as I say. The problem then, actually, I mean, not that this is particularly important to the guys that sign the checks, but the problem then is that actually the standard of driving will go down because the very great drivers will have fewer and fewer opportunities to show their difference, the difference in skill level. And again, the pen pushers are going to say, well, that's a good thing. We want all the drivers to be exactly the same in standard and have exactly the same skill levels, and then be even closer and even more crashes. It'll be brilliant for Formula One. But I'm speaking existentially almost in terms of the sport. And for me, there's nothing nicer than watching a Max Verstappen or a Lewis or a Charles or an Oscar, one of the new breed, displaying a talent that is above the ordinary. And that may well go. The opportunities to do that may well go with this trend.
Wow. Let me talk to you about Toto Wolff and James Allison signing new long-term contracts, both of whom have signed 3-year extensions to their contracts. I had a chat with a friend a couple of weeks back, and he said, quite aptly, that had he made the design philosophy mistakes that Toto and James Allison have, not more Toto than James, to be fair, but that Toto has at work, that there's no way, even if he were part owner, there's no way he'd be allowed to come into work the next morning. It is what Toto Wolff and Mercedes have done with their design philosophy and the zero pod stuff, Peter, over the last 24 months. Do you think it's a sackable offence at any other organisation not named Mercedes-AMG Petronas?
Well, the problem is it's a private club and they can do whatever they like. And if if Toto's philosophy is I want to build an incredibly slow, bad Grand Prix car because there'll be a massive amount of publicity about why Lewis Hamilton isn't winning any more races and is finishing last in every race, but we'll get lots of publicity, he can do it. It's his team and he can go and do it. It's a private club. So, comparing a Formula One team with a public company, of course, is a waste of time. So they can do whatever they like. And that's Toto. I mean, Toto's made obviously a big error there, but with everything that's happened since 2022. But it was no different from Bernie allowing Gordon Murray to build that car in which sadly Elio De Angelis lost his life, or Ferrari going completely off the boil in 1973 to the point where they actually pulled out of Grand Prix racing to go and get John Thompson to build them a car, or things like that. And it happens all the time. Frank Williams obviously made a lot of bad calls as well as good ones. So did Ron Dennis. And Toto's made a couple of bad calls, but he's got an incredible record. And I actually, I don't know. I think he's a cool guy, Toto. I haven't done it very much, but I'd like to sit down with him and just chat to him about a lot of other things other than just racing. And I think he's got a very good brain. And I've just said many times, actually, the job Toto has to do is to keep the money coming in. Yes, the technical team may get it wrong, and that's partly his fault, but actually it's not really, because he's not an engineer. He's the guy that goes out there and finds the money and keeps the team together and gets the bills paid. And he's done that pretty well through thick and thin. So I don't think you can really criticize Toto very much. James Allison is a different story. I mean, if I was Toto now, probably I would have done the same thing with James. But then the question arises, why did he let James sort of go a little bit away from the whole thing in the first place? If he's that good and you've got that much faith in him, what's going on? So that's a bit odd. But if he can't have Adrian, I think having James and his team is probably as good a bet as anything else out there. So I don't feel that negative about those two decisions to, those new contract extensions, to be honest.
Fair. He's a good man, is Toto, and like you said, a sound brain. I think just millions of Mercedes fans, one of which I am, very short term and just kind of want to see them back where they used to be, 8-time constructors and all that. But I think you're right to call for a bit of calm and a bit of stoicism there, Peter. He's done a fantastic job. James Allison apparently is still splitting his time across Mercedes and Ineos. What do you think about that, Peter, bearing in mind where they are? Would you not like to see one FTE worth of James Allison's time as opposed to him splitting still across Mercedes and Ineos and their America's Cup endeavour?
Well, do we know that to be true? I mean, I can't imagine that Toto's done a new deal with him without saying to James, we need you to be giving this all the attention that it deserves. And James giving him that assurance. If that means periodically he can still consult on other jobs that he's been doing, but not take too much time doing it, fair enough, leave it to James. I mean, he's over 21, he can sort out his own life. And with engineers, you've got to give them a little bit of freedom, a little bit of latitude to live their lives. They're all different. They're all quite, I wouldn't say difficult to manage, but they all require attention and management, good management. And I think Toto's one of those. The shining example is Christian Horner and how he's managed Adrian Newey over the years. And I think Toto is aware of that, and he's probably thinking, yeah, I'm going to manage James Allison the same way. I've got this guy and he's a nugget of gold, and I need to make sure we get the best from him. And if that requires James to doing a little bit of flying, a little bit of sailing, whatever he wants to do, let him go and do it.
Speaking of Adrian Newey, Peter, I listened to a podcast a couple of days ago where he was talking about his route into aerodynamics, and he spoke of a brilliant story where the Leighton House car, which was very, very good around a few tracks, but not so good around more, that Alain Prost in his McLaren MP44 was tailing Ivan Capelli in the Leighton House car and backed off into a long curve, anticipating that there's no way that Ivan could carry so much speed through that curve, and that he was going to have a humongous accident. So competent aerodynamically was that Leighton House car. I mean, you've worked with Adrian, Peter. Is he cheat codes aerodynamically, having him in your team? Has he always been that good as far as his ability to see flow and build a championship winning car?
Yes, he has. He's yes, and not only aerodynamics. I mean, he's had the ability to design and build a complete car almost from day one, ever since he put a Tamiya Lotus 49 together as a plastic kit as a kid. And he has this wonderful blend of practicality and sophisticated mathematics. Obviously, the practicality sometimes suffers as a result of his genius. And maybe we saw a little bit of that at Leighton House, and where he wanted to go with the next Leighton House. And I think he worked very well in harmony with Patrick Head at Williams. And Patrick was the ultimate pragmatist, as well as a very good engineer. And I think that had a big benefit on Adrian's thinking. That's my opinion. Adrian may not agree with that, but I was there, and I'm pretty confident that was the case. And I think we saw that then in the McLarens, and then he, and just shows the racer that's in him, that he then wanted to go to Red Bull, because that was effectively his Leighton House unfinished story, and he wanted to write the ending. And that's the racer side of Adrian. He likes to be on the pit wall. He's a racer. He likes to have the stopwatch in the hand. And when he's not doing all that, he'd rather be in a 1966 Ford GT40 at Le Mans in the wet, doing 200 miles an hour on the straight, trying to outbrake Frank Sitner. And that's what makes him such a great engineer, in my view. He's a sort of Colin Chapman in that sense. Chapman being obviously a very fast racing driver as well. And so far as aerodynamics go, yeah, I mean, it's very clear that Adrian was on the ball logically, being very logical about it, but at the same time creative and looking for opportunities very, very early in his career. And when that Leighton House came out, I was around then going to all the races. It was very clear that it had phenomenal downforce. And not taking away from Ivan Capelli, because I really rate Ivan. He was in Maurizio Gugelmin, he was really, really good in that car. He got the best from it, and it was a great car. It was a great car. They just ran out of money, and that was obviously something that Adrian learnt. And when he went to Red Bull, I'm sure in the back of his mind was nothing other than, and is this going to continue? How long are Red Bull going to be around? Is the money going to run out, just as it did in the Leighton House days? And you've got Christian there saying, no, let's go and meet Dietrich Mateschitz in the mountains in his private lodge, and Dietrich looking into Adrian's eyes and saying, right, I'm going to do it. And that's the way to sell a company like Red Bull. It's to the engineer. And I don't believe, when Ron was doing his deals, or Frank, that they would have been that upfront with their engineers. Obviously, in the case of John Barnard, it was slightly different, because the whole thing was based around the carbon chassis, and they could go to Philip Morris, i.e. to John Hogan, and say, this is the new world, and I've got the new world, and if you want the new world, you got to get rid of Teddy and Tyler. And John said yes, and that was that. But that was a kind of, it was the carbon chassis as much as it was John Barnard, and it was a wonderful thing. But with Adrian, it was yet another engineer. How good really was this guy? And Christian, to his credit, got that to work. So, yeah, Adrian, just a fascinating racing person who's made everybody else look like idiots, really, to be honest, over the last, decade, really.
Peter, let's fast forward. I love going back into history with you. In fact, I wanted to ask you about Prost and Senna. This is another argument that I've been having with friends very recently. As a young buck, I always thought that Ayrton Senna was like the apex predator of racing drivers, right? Super quick, relentless in his drive, an inner belief that was unwavering. And I always felt that ultimately, over the course of a championship, that there was nobody in history that would ever beat that chap. But going back and looking at it and seeing Prost's pragmatism, I've had to revisit that ever so slightly. I'm not sure that Ayrton Senna was so much superior to the likes of Prost and Lauda and PK even. Speaking specifically to Prost and Senna, Peter, as somebody who was around the F1 calendar at the time, which one of those guys, over the course of a championship, if you had to pick one between Prost and Senna, I've always wanted to ask you this, which one are you going for to get it done over the course?
If they're racing against one another in the same team, you mean?
Yeah, over the course of a championship.
Well, I would always have gone with Alan Prost, because he was calm and he was methodical, and he didn't get flustered, and he wasn't emotional in the way he drove, and he had a very, very economical style. His pace came from short corners, from incredible finesse and getting the car in early, using extending the straights at the end of the straight and at the beginning of the next straight, not worried about high minimum speeds, corner rotation speeds at all. In fact, his minimum rotation speed was always quite low, relatively low compared with Ayrton. But he was unbelievably consistent and metronomic in the way he drove. And he found that after about a year. And I think he really found that in his first year with McLaren, to be honest, as bad as the McLaren was that year. And so I love that about a racing driver, that he can repeat that. And it's all because he's manipulating the car and he's not being shocked by the car ever. Whereas Ayrton, as you say, was absolutely super quick, longer corners. So his pace came from super late braking, perfect application of steering and throttle on a longer radius corner. But he didn't have many places to go if things went slightly wrong, as they did at Cadwell Park in Formula 3, when he just took off and lost the steering effectively and went straight into a marshal's post. And that was Ayrton. He never changed the way he drove. And he always had that throttle blipping business in Formula 3 onwards, which was a trait he tried to get rid of, but never did. And yes, Ayrton was imperfect in many ways compared with Prost, and he was more emotional. Of course, you could argue that that is what racing drivers are all about. He was a very human, fallible racing driver, born of his emotions. But if you're running a race team, it would be difficult to find anybody better than Alan Prost, race in, race out, just to do the job.
Peter, I love that. I absolutely love that. I was shocked to find out that in '89, when Prost won, that he only beat Senna on track once that whole time. Those other victories were when Senna had either DNF'd or reliability issues, which were much more pertinent back then. Do you think, Peter, that that's is that the lack of mechanical empathy that Senna had that Prost was so good with, right? That he did the old Fangio thing, trying to win using the least resources over the course of a race distance, right?
Yeah, and that's definitely how Prost drove. He was always like Nigel Mansell. I'm not sure he wouldn't be flat on the throttle every lap on the straight. He'd always be just feathering off slightly just to save everything. And Ayrton was a guy, if he could find 20 revs more by doing something, he would do it. And he would push the Honda engineers into zones that they didn't want to talk about. We're in the red now, but what really happens if we're in the red? And that was Ayrton. Everything had to be on the absolute limit. And it's a little bit like Graham Hill v Jim Clark in '67 with the Cosworth Lotus 49, because Graham had a lot of retirements. And Jimmy, I'm not saying that, broken spark plugs by any means Graham Hill's fault, but Jimmy had this feel that the car was new, it was fragile, it was a Lotus, it was a new engine. So everything he drove was wrapped in cotton wool. Everything he did was wrapped in cotton wool, saving 20% just for things that, might go wrong, and driving the thing at 80%. And, that wasn't the way Ayrton thought. Ayrton was in a racing car, but when the lights went out or the flag dropped, whatever it was, he was absolutely on the limit. Whereas Prost would be of the Jim Clark philosophy. I got to add Nigel Mansell philosophy there. I mean, you haven't mentioned Nigel, but I think Nigel, in all his races with Ayrton, showed that Ayrton was definitely beatable. And again, a great short corner driver in a good car was always going to beat a great longer corner driver, at the risk of being boring about short and long corners. But to me, it's something it's like saying, it's so boring to talk about racing cars with four wheels on. Why don't you talk about six-wheel racing cars? If you start saying, oh, we're not allowed to talk about short and long corners anymore, you might as well not talk about racing, because they're there and they are the differences. And that is what defines a great driver from an average driver, Grand Prix driver.
I suppose, Peter, this is the language that you speak, right? But that, ironically, is the language that the Drive to Survive generation probably aren't interested in. They want to know who's dating who and what the gossip is on in the pit lane at any particular time, which leads me very nicely to my next question, Peter. Drive to Survive, new series, February the 23rd. On a scale of 1 to 10, how excited are you about the Netflix series, latest series coming out?
Well, I don't subscribe to Netflix, so I can't really. You're not offering me 0 to 10, so it was something below 1, I have to say, because I'm not sure it's great, and I don't want this to come out the wrong way, but I'm not sure it's a great thing for human nature to sustain it with gossip and or stuff that's to do with materialism and glamour. I think it's the other way. I think Formula One has this wonderful DNA of its technology. And I think it's sad that Drive to Survive, I think it's called, that Drive to Survive doesn't focus 100% on the technology of the cars, because that's what we're not getting. The young fans out there are not getting the technology. They can't touch and feel it because the garage doors are shut, the bodyguards are big, and the press know nothing at all. So how are they going to get that? That's what Drives to Survive, in my opinion, should be all about. It's making Formula One's DNA available to the public, and we should be understanding what problems Mercedes have had in the wind tunnel over the last 2 years, why Ferrari can get the car to work only on circuits with long straights. We should all be au fait with that. And it shouldn't all be a mystery. And are they going to get it right? Are they going to get it wrong? We should be all touching and feeling those design offices. That's where it should be, not all this ridiculous glamour and stuff. Because you can get that from a million other programs. You go and watch all those reality shows. I'm not that I ever watched them, but I assume that's what they're all about. You know, Lost on a Desert Island, whatever it is. Go and watch that if you want all that. But if you want to watch something to do with Formula One, let's talk about real Formula One, which is the thing that it uses to sell its entire being, which is its technology. It is the pinnacle of motorsport technology. How many times do we hear that? But we never get to see it. So I think they're missing a massive trick there, I think, and just taking a sort of tiny bit of cream off the top, which probably isn't very good for the human soul anyway. So that's my view.
Oh, Mr. Windsor, controversy. I'll push back on you for a second there with the Drive to Survive stuff, because I think the take is that the likes of me and you, Peter, are always going to be here watching quali on a Saturday and then tuning in for a 2-hour race, irrespective of Drive to Survive, right? But there is a massive portion of the sports viewing world that up until very recently, the last 5 or 6 years, had never even seen or touched F1, but yet they will watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians or a Love Island or whatever other trash TV. So you kind of got to... I think Netflix are worthy of some credit in that they've packaged this docu-series and that it's in a language that the 18 to 35s who spend 10 hours a day on TikTok looking at whatever rubbish it is, that they've packaged Drive to Survive in a way that those 18 to 35-year-olds are drawn to. Even my wife, as an example, Peter, she's never watched an F1 race, nor will she ever in her life, but she'll sit down and watch a couple episodes of Drive to Survive. So it's
yeah, but in fairness to you, Cameron, and people like you, if F1 had rung you 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and said, Cameron, we're really impressed with what you're doing on YouTube and how your knowledge combines with enthusiasm. We'd like to give you full access to the Formula One paddock, to put together a team of people to produce a series about the private lives of Formula One racing drivers. And you're going to have access to all the drivers. You can talk to them at agreed times and you can film them doing whatever you really wanted them to do. You don't think you could have done a good job with that?
It's a good shout.
You see my point. It's not as if this is magic. It's like, yeah, okay, let's go and film it. It's not that difficult to go out and do stuff that's never been done before because the access has never been given. My point is that the true response actually to that would have been, okay, and I'm just putting the needle on the record again and playing the record. But my response is, okay, we want GoPro cameras in all the road cars driving to and from the circuits. We want GoPro cameras in all the debriefs and all the briefings before they go out in the car. We want GoPro cameras in all the drivers' briefings. And we want GoPro cameras in the garage when the driver gets out of the car, when he's retired in the race. And we want to film exactly what he says the minute he takes off his helmet and balaclava. And we want to be able to follow that for 10 minutes. And if we can't do that, we don't want to do anything. And that should have been that's what we should have got. The reality of Formula One. I'm not saying that all that stuff, all that peripheral stuff, the glamour, is unimportant. Of course it's important. And of course human nature is attracted to that. All I'm saying is, let's get the real stuff. It's out there. And of course the teams would have said, oh, you can't do that. You can't film this. You can't film that. Okay, you're not in the Concord Agreement. You're out. Okay, next. And that's how it should have been. But it's not. And it's kind of this sort of gossamer, fairyland of stuff that, to me, doesn't sit with Fangio going through the downhill S's at Rouen in a 250F Maserati in a four-wheel drift. And that is the disconnect that I'm talking about. And I think that disconnect could have been avoided. And here again, I'm trying to be positive and not be negative. And I'm sure Netflix and their team could have done an even better job if they were given the tools that I've just mentioned. That's my point. And then everyone would then you'd have double the number of young people saying Formula One is the sport for me. You'd have all the ones saying, I love it because I think Pierre Gasly's really cool and I want to know who his next girlfriend's going to be or whatever it is. But equally, you'd get the young engineers, the young would-be engineers saying, wow, can you believe how Mercedes managed to get the high downforce car so wrong with the porpoising? Why didn't they realize the center of pressure hit? And that would be good. That would be good for Formula One, because then you'd have a double whammy. You'd have the engineering and then you'd have the materialism. But at the moment, we only have the materialism. And I think that's, as we've seen in human history, it's not a great thing when all of the energy flows towards materialism and not towards something deeper.
I can't disagree with a syllable of what you've just said there, Peter. Very succinct and very eloquently put. Finally, let's look ahead to next season. How excited are you for next season, and what are the kind of story arcs that you've got a keen, discerning F1 eye on into 2024?
I'd like to see. I'm interested in the Daniel Ricciardo Yuki Tsunoda square off, because this is effectively, if Yuki doesn't blow Daniel away, I'd say his career is probably gone. And equally, if Daniel doesn't blow Yuki away, his career is probably gone. So there's a lot riding on those two. And I think that car will probably be quite good. Not because Christian Horner is playing a larger role now with, what's it called? Visa Cash App, whatever. He's bridging towards that other team a little bit. But because there's some good people at AlphaTauri, if we can still call them that, and there's a lot of technology there that they should be getting. So, I can't imagine that car's going to be slow. So that's one thing I'm looking forward to seeing, that squaring off between the two drivers there. I think it'd be interesting to see how Kevin Magnussen goes now with softer management. Soft is the wrong word, with more understanding management, perhaps. I've got a lot of time for Kevin as a racing driver and as a procurer of a very, very fast qualifying lap. And I think he may blossom in this new regime. He may not, and it may all be a disaster, and they may run out of money or whatever it is. But I'm interested to see how well Kevin drives now, because I think he's, as good as he is, I think he's a bit unfulfilled still in terms of what he can do. So that's one. What else? Oscar. I think how Oscar goes against Lando. A lot of winter talk about Lando. I think everybody looking at his podii and assuming that he's going to dominate. But to me, Oscar Piastri's got a massive amount of innate talent that I don't think Lando has got his head around, and I think to see how Oscar now develops year two will be fascinating. He wasn't particularly good with tire management last year, but then getting the Pirelli tires to last is boring and B, irritating. So no surprise that he's taking a while to get his head around that. And I suspect Pirelli are going to be under more pressure to produce tires that go off the cliff very quickly, because that's an easy fix to a boring race, just have a billion pit stops. And that's not very healthy either, is it? So for anyone. And, I hope that doesn't happen, but I'm sure it will. I'm not a massive fan of pit stops and lightning fast pit stops. I think we've all kind of got a bit numb about those. It doesn't really mean much to us anymore. And I, quite often you don't really see changes in position these days. The strategists do such a good job with all their software that you can kind of predict what's going to happen pit stop wise. So I'm not fussed about that. I wish there were a few DRS zones, but that's not going to happen. So there we go. And I hope nobody gets hurt. I think it would be a final thing.
Agreed. We've had quite a good run with that stuff, right? The safety and the...
Well, when I think about those blind high-speed S's at where's Riyadh, I mean, I just feel terrible every time a car's going through there on a quick lap. And it's not the curbs, it's the blindness of it all, and the high speed, and there's nowhere to go. And that's not good.
And the engineers need to be quicker and more responsive, as far as, I mean, they keep tripping over each other, right, in practice and qualifying, because the track's so congested. So here's hoping that the FIA, together with the race engineers, can mitigate against any potential serious life-threatening incidents going forward for 24.
Yeah. I mean, I think safety should always be paramount, because I've come from many eras of unbelievable danger. And so for me, racing can never be safe enough, within reason, obviously. But at the moment, I think Formula One is doing a great job with safety, and all credit to all the people involved.
It's, Peter, it's interesting. I give you a lot of credit for that, mate, because a lot of the guys who have been around F1 for a long time, most noteworthy probably Martin Brundle, of particularly around the halo, let's say, is a good case study for this, were very resistant, citing arguments such as it makes the car look ugly. I think there's a better solution. Even some of the drivers, right, to a certain extent, were very resistant against the halo. But yourself, you've always leaned very firmly into any substantive safety improvements that the FIA can make. Like you don't suffer fools gladly as far as that. And I suppose that's...
No, I don't. I mean, in fairness to Martin, he wasn't around at Monza in '78 when Vittorio Brambilla was hit by a front wheel, was unconscious for I don't know how many days. And he wasn't around, obviously, at Watkins Glen when Francois Sever was killed, or Marcus Hottinger was killed by guardrail straight into the cockpit area. And so it goes on, Peter Revson. And so you only have to have lived through those moments to just know innately that we've got to be as safe as we can. We can't have those days ever again. And my heart still bleeds when I think about Revy or Tom Price or Marcus Hottinger or Francois or Ronnie. It just goes on, and it's there's just no excuse for not making racing as safe as you can possibly make it within obvious bounds.
Wow. Love that, Mr. Windsor. You're an absolute legend. These talks are always enlightening, is probably an understatement. I love getting forensic with you about both past and present F1 topics. We're going to have to do these more often, mate.
Yeah, no, it's... well, I think... thank you, Cameron, for saying that. And A and B, I think to look ahead or to look even down where we are today without looking behind is just foolishness, because we are where we are today because of what happened yesterday. And if we don't learn from that, then how can we move forward into the future? But I'm going to try, and it may be a little bit because he's just having the odd off at the moment on his leg, but we wish him very well. But I'm going to try and do a little bit of that with Nigel Roebuck in months to come as well. Just chatting about little things like how often did Alfonso de Portago get his leather jacket dry cleaned, or how many times did Jean Barrett actually put on a suit and tie throughout his professional career? Little important details like that. And these are not materialistic things in the that I've been talking about. These are important details.
Oh, Peter, I absolutely love it, mate. You've been
in answer to the Portago leather jacket. I can tell you that I mentioned that because Nigel once asked Xabi Krombach, who knew de Portago pretty well, about the leather jacket, because he said he seemed to wear it all the time. And Xabi said, yes, it was very smelly.
Your stories, Peter, are absolutely incredible. How about Riccardo Patrese, by the way, grabbing Nigel Mansell's crotch? I've never heard that one before. But
no. Good bloke, Riccardo, lovely guy. Anybody who has... well, he and Sam Posey, without doubt, are the racing drivers with the two best model railway layouts in the world. Riccardo in Italy, Sam in the United States, and both of them ace drivers and ace people. So yeah, and Riccardo was actually the first guy. Here's a materialistic thing for you. He's the first guy to wear Todd's trainers, sneakers, leather, driving shoes, moccasins, I think they're probably called, in the Formula One paddock. And he discovered Todd's long before Jean Todt or anybody else. And they were just a tiny shop in the edge of Milan at that point. And I remember going up to him and saying, wow, great, very cool shoes, Riccardo. And he gave me the number, and I went to the Todd shop when it was just one shop before they had any others. And I've still got the same pair of moccas.
These stories, I'm telling you, mate, they're golden. You wanna package them.
Well, the other thing about Ricardo was that he got this offer to drive for Shadow in, what was it, 77, I think it was, and Jackie Oliver said, okay, you didn't go and do the British Grand Prix or whatever it was, and I'll meet you at this is where I live or something like that, and gave me his address. And Ricardo arrived, didn't speak a word of English, got to Gatwick, had absolutely no idea how to get to London, let alone, meet Jackie Oliver in his house. And a mate of mine actually found him wandering around Pimlico, and he said, what were you doing? You're the racing driver. I said, yeah, and he was completely lost, completely and utterly lost, and put his arm around and got him in. And he really gave Oliver a dressing down about that. I remember that. Quite funny.
Oh, Peter.
This is when Ricardo had been super quick in that Chevron F2 car.
Right.
He was really good.
Story time with PW. We're going to have to do more of this, Peter. I'm telling you, but you've been more than generous with your time today, mate. Thank you so much.
Oh, Cameron, it's always a pleasure talking to you, mate. Thank you so much.
Superb. Go and check out the Short Corners podcast, Peter Windsor, all sport podcasting platforms, sans Apple currently, but soon to be Apple. If you're watching on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. It really helps the channel. This has been the F1 Hour. That has been Peter Windsor. I've been Cameron F1, and we'll see you next time. But between now and then, look, but never stare. Peace.